section to pose and answer questions. After we move on from the headlines piece and before we go into our deep dive, we will have just a minute for some quick questions about the headlines topics. And so if you see a question as we're speaking, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and we will get to those when we're through. Okay, so let's now take a look at this month's top headlines. In congressional news, so Congress is starting to get to work on their 2020 appropriations bills, and you will be hearing a lot more about that in the next several minutes. But wanted you to know that we do follow many of the activities that happen in Congress, especially related to science funding, and you can find summaries of events like the NSF director testifying before Congress, the NIH director as well, on our website and in our biweekly newsletter. So if you're curious about what they're saying and how they're defending the president's budget, you can find that coverage on our website. We'll also touch on this a little bit later, but we have a current action alert up on our website related to spending caps. We'll put a pin in that and talk more about it, but if you haven't taken a look at that action alert by following the link on the page there's the resource for you, and I encourage you to do that. Turning to administration or executive branch news, again, the administration released its 2020 budget request, the full details. If you participated last month, you know that we talked about some preliminary details of what we knew so far. But today what we really plan to do is go a bit deeper into the individual agencies and give you a sense of some of the nuances that we're seeing in science agency budget requests. In other executive branch news, the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research and statistical arm of the Department of Education, has out for public comment a set of priorities to help guide IES's research work over the next couple of years. So there's an open call for review and comment, and you can find that at the link on the screen. Comments have to be received before May 28th in order to be considered by the National Board for Education Sciences, which sets priorities for the agency. So if you feel strongly that IES has been missing something in its research priorities over in the past or in recent years, certainly take a look at the priorities they propose and comment before May 28th. At NSF, they have released a Dear Colleague letter on research on sexual harassment in STEM. As many of you know, NSF has really taken a leadership role in the sort of sexual harassment in science and academia area by issuing a pretty far-reaching policy. This is a next step in their efforts. They have essentially put out a call for researchers who may be interested in researching the underlying dynamics and nature of sexual and other forms of harassment, and so have established sort of liaison positions within the foundation, within the different directorates and divisions, to help researchers and grantees determine whether a research idea they may have in this space would be appropriate for NSF funding. So you can find all the details about that Dear Colleague letter in the link on the screen or in the COSSA Washington update. We linked to it there as well. Turning to some community news, the National Academy of Medicine within the National Academies has issued a national call for commitment statements on countering the U.S. opioid epidemic. Essentially, what they're looking to do is to find ways to discuss and share what organizations are doing, whether it's across health professions education or prescribing guidelines or prevention, treatment, research, data, metrics, etc., collecting those statements and goals and commitments to act to respond to the opioid epidemic. And so they have this online form that organizations can complete to submit what your organization is doing. And hopefully the outcome will be a larger sharing of the science and the evaluation that's out there to help address this epidemic. Similarly, the National Academies has released a new consensus study, this one on medications for opioid use disorder saves lives. Late last month, they released this report, and essentially the committee was tasked with examining the evidence base for medications to treat opioid use disorders and to identify barriers that prevent people from accessing safe, effective medication-based treatment. And so their findings and recommendations and conclusions can be found in that recently released report, again with the link there on your screen. And turning to COSSA news, we are just 3 weeks away from Social Science Advocacy Day on April 30th and May 1st. And I know many of you are participating in today's webinar because you are coming to Washington, so thank you for that. This will be today a preview of some of the material we will go over during our seminar as part of Advocacy Day to help you start thinking now about how you want to approach your meetings. But we'll also talk about some things that those of you who can't come to Washington can do from home. Those of you not currently signed up, there is still time to sign up for Advocacy Day if you'd like. You can register online or you can be in touch with any one of us on staff and we can walk you through the process. In other COSSA news, we're really excited that Congressman Paul Tonko from New York is the latest contributor to our Why Social Science blog series. He writes about why social science is important as it relates to climate change. And it's a really excellent piece. And you can check it out at whysocialscience.com. And I hope you'll also, while you're there, subscribe to receive these directly into your inbox once a month once they're released. Similar to what we'll be talking about in a couple of minutes, we have COSSA every year submits written testimony to the House and to the Senate in support of our community's funding priorities. And so just in the last week, we have submitted testimony in support of the National Science Foundation, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the NIH, several statistical agencies, and a few others. And this is really a way for us to get on the record in support of increased, sustainable, robust funding for agencies that we care about and agencies from which you get funding from perhaps. So if you're interested in seeing what our testimony says, those are available on our website as well. And finally, many of you may have received in the mail a copy of our hot off the presses 2018 annual report. It's also available online if you didn't receive a hard copy, but we're really excited to share this with you all as it really does provide a good snapshot of everything that our team as well as our community has been able to accomplish over the last year, which is really a lot. And so we hope you'll take a look at that, but also share it with others so that they can really fully understand the breadth of what COSSA does and how important it is for you as members of our community to engage in our activities as well. Of course, all of these news items are found in our COSSA Washington update, which comes out every other week. Hopefully you're receiving that in your inbox on Tuesdays. If you're not, you can go to the link there and register for that to receive it directly. It's free and open, not just to members, but others as well. And so encourage others to sign up as well. Okay, I'm gonna pause just for a second. I don't see any questions in the chat box yet. But this is not your only opportunity to ask questions. And so you can type them into the chat box during the deep dive discussion, which we'll turn to next. And then at the end of the presentation, we will mute the lines for those of you who have perhaps more complex questions to ask our questions over the computer audio or through your telephone. Okay, so let's move on. So our deep dive topic for today is FY 2020 Part 2, Time to Act. We'll start with a recap of what's included or perhaps not included in the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request, which was released last month. So during our March headlines, for those of you who weren't with us, we had only preliminary details on the President's budget request for next year. Since then, the full details have been released for all of the federal departments and agencies that we care about. And while the news is not great, as you can see from the snapshot on the screen, we've discussed last month that we don't expect the numbers shown here to really be the final outcome for the agencies that we care about. Also, since our last webinar, we, the COSSA team, has produced and released our full analysis of the budget request, which looks like the document on your screen there. And this can be found on our website. This report provides details on all of the agencies important to our country. So I would encourage you to check it out to find full tables, many of which we'll show you in just a second, as well as narrative on what some of these proposed numbers would mean for agencies should they become law. Now that we have fuller details, we thought we would walk you through some of the more notable pieces of the budget request. Oopsie. So for the National Science Foundation, I know there's a lot of information on the screen here, but the number you should pay attention to right now is the President's request level and the comparison to FY19 that you see next to it. So for NSF, the President's request is about $7.1 billion, which would be a cut of 12.5% from the enacted 2019 or current year funding level. The budget, once again, prioritizes NSF's 10 big ideas, which, if you're not familiar with them, are large, multidisciplinary initiatives that span all parts of the agency, really trying to see what interdisciplinary science can bring to bear on challenges of sort of national, international, or scientific significance. The SBE Directorate, where about 2/3 of our community's funding comes from, has declined in funding by about 15% since 2015. That's not taking into consideration the President's budget request, which is even lower than that. So if the President's request for the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Division, $230 million, was to become law, this would essentially be 16% below 2015, which was a high watermark for SBE. The two research divisions within SBE also have a lot to make up for. The Social and Economic Sciences Division is smaller presently than it was in 1998. And the Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences Division is at its lowest funding point in 15 years. So even without the President's requests on the table, it's not great news for the SBE Directorate. But what's of particular note is that these declines have not been, by and large, because of congressional direction or attack or a policymaker saying we're going to appropriate less for SBE because we don't agree with the taxpayer use, taxpayer dollars being used for this research. But actually, it's been internal NSF decision making that has led to these declines in order to free up funds for the 10 big ideas that I mentioned already. So, you know, the story here for NSF is that the President's request is bad, But NSF has been on a slight growth trajectory for the last few years, and so that's good. But that there's still work that needs to be done inside the foundation to make sure that SBE does not become the bank for other initiatives. We're gonna, me and the rest of the staff, we're gonna go agency by agency here, but certainly if you have questions, type them into the chat and we can go into more details on individual agency priorities. Okay, so turning to NIH, a little bit of a different story. NIH continues to be a huge bipartisan favorite on Capitol Hill, which most recently has been illustrated by a letter that has been signed by 222 members of the House of Representatives in support of a 2020 budget for NIH of $41.6 billion. NIH's current budget is $39.1 billion. That's for current year 2019. And the president's request seeks a 12% cut, $34.4 billion. While the NIH budget has grown by $9 billion or 30% since 2016, it's just seen huge growth in the last couple of years. There are individual institutes and centers that have not received commensurate increases due to sort of the earmarking of funds for specific initiatives, such as the Cancer Moonshot, Brain Initiative, Precision Medicine, and lots of these sort of larger sweeping activities that involve the entire agency, much like NSF with its big ideas. In fact, the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at NIH, which coordinates basic clinical and translational research in the behavioral and social sciences, and also co-funds highly rated grants in the behavioral and social sciences in partnership with individual institutes and centers, OBSSR has been held roughly flat for several years, despite the sizable increases to the NIH budget. So on the one hand, while we expect to see more increases for NIH again in 2020, there is still work that needs to be done within the agency to see that those increases are felt across the organization. Okay, and now I am going to pass things over to Camille, who will run us through the next set of agencies.
Hello, thank you, Wendy. I am going to talk briefly about the Departments of Education and Justice and the important social science programs within those agencies. Oh, it looks like I have skipped ahead too far. Okay, so I will talk now about the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the which supports research, statistics, and evaluation programs at the Department of Education, as well as the international education and foreign language programs at the department. It is very easy to say that the Department of Education is one of the least prioritized agencies in the Trump administration, and that low prioritization extends to these offices that are very important to social science within the agency. So as you can see here, the FY 2020 President's Budget requests about a 15% decrease to the Institute of Education Sciences. And that is particularly striking because this agency has been held flat for very, very many years, and they're doing important applied research in education and evaluation of education policies. And you can see within the agency that the budget request proposes eliminating the regional education laboratories and the statewide longitudinal data systems. Over the past couple of years, the administration has proposed eliminating the RELs, or the regional education laboratories, but this is the first time they've proposed eliminating the statewide educational data systems as well. So that's particularly striking. And I would like to note that COSSA is part of the Friends of IES coalition that is requesting this $670 million number, which would represent a very important increase for IES, and we do not support the elimination of those two important programs. We do not support the elimination of the RELs or the statewide data systems. Outside of IES in the Department of Education, the administration proposes eliminating the domestic and overseas programs within the international education and foreign language programs. This is the third consecutive fiscal year that the administration has proposed eliminating these programs. And that's particularly notable because while these programs have champions in Congress, they've still been held flat for many years because there is this sentiment from the administration that they should be eliminated. Sorry, it looks like I'm having trouble advancing slides again. Okay, so now moving on to the Department of Justice. There are two important agencies within the Department of Justice that support both statistics and social science research. And those two programs are the National Institute of Justice, which is the research and evaluation arm of the DOJ, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And the president's budget request for FY 2020 tells a sort of complex story because at first glance, it looks like these two offices are receiving a substantial increase compared to fiscal year 2019. And that's not exactly the case. The increases, or the numbers rather, proposed in the FY 2020 budget request are based on the House and Senate proposals from the 2019 spending bills. But I'm sure everyone remembers that government shutdown and the delayed spending for FY 19. And out of that delayed spending and that government shutdown, these two agencies actually received a shocking and devastating cut in the final FY 2019 spending bill. So after that devastating cut occurred, the department had really already set their budget request at sort of this high watermark based on prior year spending. And so I know that's sort of a roundabout way of saying that despite the fact that it looks like the agency is prioritizing these offices, it's really not. The problem is that Congress is really not prioritizing these agencies. And unfortunately, I don't have too much to illustrate why that happened, but hopefully in this coming year, we'll get an increase for those agencies, particularly because these two offices are responsible for some of the implementation of the First Step Act, which is that large bipartisan comprehensive criminal justice reform bill that was passed in the last Congress, and other important congressional mandates of criminal justice research, as well as criminal justice data collection. Okay, I'll turn it over to Julia now to talk about some other agencies.
Thanks, Camille. So I'll start with the census, which the administration is requesting a total of $6.2 billion for the Census Bureau, which is a sizable $2.3 billion increase. However, as you likely know, FY 2020 is going to encompass the 2020 census, the next decennial census, and the Bureau is going to need a big increase to account for the massive scale of the census, which is the government's largest non-military mobilization. This increase is built into the sort of 10-year structure of the census, where it ramps up and ramps down as you get closer and closer to a year ending in a zero. So it shouldn't be a shock to Congress to see an increase this big. However, you do see occasionally members of Congress who see the big increase and think that it would be an excellent spot to offset some of their pet priorities. So we'll have to be on guard for members who want to take a little here and a little there, because a succession of small cuts could really affect the census's ability to perform the operation. If you've been paying close attention to the census budget, you may notice that the number on our chart is about $1 billion less than what the administration is saying they are requesting for the census this year. And that is because they're counting about $1 billion in funding that the Census Bureau was given in previous fiscal years that it hasn't yet spent. And so that means that when you are considering the funds that would be available for the 2020 census, the administration is proposing that $5.3 billion that you see on the screen, plus an extra $1 billion. So about $6.3 billion to actually do the 2020 census. However, their request is actually $1 billion below its most recent public cost estimate, below the Census Bureau's most recent estimate, which was published in December 2017. And that billion, I mean the total $6.3 billion, including that extra $1 billion. So they're really quite low, quite a lot lower than what they said they would need for this year. And according to Census Bureau officials, the reason for that lower ask for this year is because they've done some newer cost estimates that came in lower, but none of that information has been made public, and so we don't know what assumptions they are relying on to come to that number. And so quite a number of us in the community are a little skeptical that their requested amount would be sufficient to conduct the census, particularly given that the citizenship question still hangs over the decennial. This week, as you may have seen, a third judge ruled that the citizenship question was added illegally and needs to be removed from the 2020 census form. However, we're still waiting for the Supreme Court to decide on the matter, and it has promised that it would make a ruling sometime in June. And so what you have is the Census Bureau sort of operating in this dual reality where under current legally standing rulings, the citizenship question should not be on the census. So the Census Bureau is preparing for a 2020 that does not have it. However, they know that the Supreme Court could very well add it back just a few months ahead of Census Day. And so then they would have to scramble to add it back on. We don't know what that uncertainty is doing in terms of the budget for the census. Not to mention that we believe that the citizenship question, if it were added, would increase non-response, which would make the census more expensive. And even without it, all of the controversy, some have speculated, may make people less likely to respond to the census, increasing the costs. So because of all of this uncertainty and our skepticism about the administration's cost estimate, our community is asking for significantly more money than the president at that $8.45 billion figure that you see on the screen, with 7.6 being dedicated solely to the 2020 census. And assuming the slides advance, I will talk about other statistical agencies. There they go. So I'm going to give an overview now of some of the other statistical agencies. I'm not going to go one by one on this chart, but if you do have a question about an agency that I don't address, I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A portion. So to start even more general than these individual agencies, I want to mention the activities surrounding the evidence-based policymaking efforts, the passage of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which, if you happen to watch our headlines that we did in February with Nick Hart, we talked a lot about that bill and what its passage could mean, and so I certainly encourage you to go back and listen to that discussion. So for those of you who've been following this, you may know that that bill did not come with any funding. The president's budget request actually does include $7 million, which is spread across the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, and Census to begin to develop a U.S. federal data service, similar to the one proposed by the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. That data service would promote government-wide data access and sharing, improve cross-agency data discovery and utilization, and enhance privacy and confidentiality practices. The money would also support the Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building, which was created by this Evidence Act. And it would help that committee implement pilot projects designed to improve access and use of data, inform the acquisition of non-survey-based source data, integrate those data with survey and administrative data, and pilot applications of new technology and methods for protecting privacy and confidentiality. So there's actually a little bit in the budget that would help implement this bill, which is exciting to see that the administration is getting behind it. I'd like to turn to BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You may remember that last year, the administration proposed to move BLS into the Department of Commerce as a way to centralize the production of economic and demographic statistics. It would be administratively sort of in the same place as Census and BEA. The move is intended to allow the agencies to collaborate and share resources to improve efficiency and enhance the quality and cost effectiveness of the data that they produce. And actually the statistical community has been pretty supportive of this proposal, although of course it all will depend on the details of implementation. There is common language in the BLS, BEA, and Census budget requests saying that the agencies plan to continue to identify next steps, but that they're going to wait until the 2020 census is mostly completed to move forward. BLS is also facing a physical relocation with its lease ending soon. The budget proposes that $655 million figure for BLS, which includes $40 million to use for the move. It would be a sort of one-time increase that would be used over a few fiscal years. And that would essentially leave them with flat funding. So I wanted to point that out because you'll see COSSA's request actually matches the president's request. However, our request is for BLS's core programs, not for this move. So we would like to see an increase to BLS for its actual course programs and for Congress to sort of decide how to fund this move separately. BLS is currently exploring a move to Suitland, Maryland, which into the same facility that houses Census and BEA. So that sort of ties to the administrative reorganization that the administration has proposed. To move to ERS within the Department of Agriculture, ERS has been working to implement a proposal that would both physically move ERS out of the Washington, D.C. area and bureaucratically move them away from the research mission area of USDA, where they currently sit with the other statistical and science agencies within the department. Unlike the move with BLS, COSSA and other advocates really feel this would hurt the agency. It would essentially make ERS worse at accomplishing its mission, while we believe the BLS move would make it better. So that's the sort of criteria we use for evaluating these proposals. They would lose a lot of expertise and talent by forcing staff to either agree to move to some unidentified location or quit, and they'd potentially be subject to increased political pressure within from being located within a policy division of USDA. So the administration is requesting $60.5 million for ERS, which includes $15.5 million for this physical move, which actually would leave ERS with only $45 million for its core programs, which is almost a 50% cut, so really would devastate the agency. The last agency I'd like to talk about is NCHS. I think their budget situation is a pretty good illustration of the budget struggles across the statistical system, so I just am highlighting them, but this is a story that you see across agencies. Their budget has been flat for the past several fiscal years, and the administration is proposing to cut it. And because NCHS has been facing rising costs, conducting surveys are more expensive, and the things they're trying to measure are getting more complicated, which leaves NCHS with essentially no wiggle room in its budget. The request of that $5 million cut, which doesn't seem like a lot, would actually force them to shut down one of their major surveys. And even with flat funding again, they're basically doing the bare minimum. They don't have funding to invest in innovating or modernizing, which they desperately need to do in order to improve their surveys and develop the next generation of federal statistics. They need to do this work simultaneously while producing the data that communities across the country rely on. So this is something that needs additional investment. They can't just use existing money. And this is, as I said, a problem faced by agencies across the statistical system, notably BLS, for example. And with that, I will try to pass the baton back to Wendy, I think, or Camille. Let's see what's next. Looks like Camille.
Thanks so much, Julia. We will now talk about Congress's response to the president's budget request. So, as we discussed in last month's headlines, Congress absolutely has to raise the spending caps that were put in place by the Budget Control Act of 2010 to pass any of the spending bills at the level in which they want to spend. If you have any questions about this, it's very in the weeds, but we're happy to talk about it because it's a really important policy that is really stifling movement on appropriations and stifling the discretionary appropriations from which science funding comes. So, however, while they have to do this very important policy of lifting these BCA caps, they also have to start moving on FY 2020 appropriations because they only have until the end of this September to finalize the 12 appropriations bills that they have to write. There's a lot of negotiations that need to go into that. And as part of the appropriations process, members of Congress are making their priorities known. So many years ago, the use of earmarks was banned, but members of Congress can still submit requests to the Appropriations Committee for agencies they care about and for agency budgets that impact their districts. And one of the ways they make their priorities known, which is in addition to maybe asking questions in appropriations committees if they serve on those committees, or writing to the appropriations committees on their priorities, is by signing on to Dear Colleague letters, which are letters that many members of Congress in either the House or the Senate sign on to. And here's just a short selection of those Dear Colleague letters that members of Congress have signed on to support increased budgets for the agencies that COSSA tracks closely and cares about. And Wendy mentioned one earlier for the NIH. Over 200 members of the House of Representatives signed onto a letter basically saying, you know what, Trump administration, we actually support increased investment in NIH instead of decreased investment in NIH. And the same goes for NSF, IES, the Census Bureau. And notably, I want to draw everyone's attention down to the very last bullet because 106 representatives have signed onto a letter to support the Department of Education's International Education and Foreign Language programs. This program was eliminated in the president's budget request, and all of these representatives have come out, bipartisan representatives have come out to support a nearly 50% increase for those two agencies. And so on the next slide, I know you've seen a lot of tables already today, and so I won't stay on this one for very long, but I just want to draw everyone's attention to the enacted level for fiscal year 2019 and the president's budget request for fiscal year 2019. So the column that's highlighted in red to the right is what's enacted right now, what the government is currently working with. And I just want to show how different these two amounts are. Clearly, congressional priorities differ greatly from the administration. And even notably, part of this chart, particularly all of the programs in the Department of Health and Human Services, those numbers were enacted whenever Congress and the executive branch were being held by the same party. So of course, now that's not the case. The House of Representatives is now controlled by the Democrats, but a lot of this was negotiated so much differently when Republicans still had control of both chambers of Congress. So that's just how much we need to sort of now step forward away from the president's budget request and start thinking about how we can advance our priorities with Congress.
And this is Julia again, and I am back to talk about how the community is strategizing around knowing what the president requested and knowing how Congress is likely to react, what we're doing. So the main issue right now, as Camille mentioned, is those budget caps, because without a deal to raise the caps, no one is going to see funding for any funding increases for any agency. So COSSA is joining the broader scientific community, as well as organizations who care about all kinds of agencies that fall into what we call the non-defense discretionary funding bucket. Topics like education, public health, housing, and the environment to advocate for a deal to raise the budget caps. Hopefully you've seen the action alert that we issued a few weeks ago asking Congress to work towards a budget deal. And our action alert has messaging tailored to the impact of the caps on the social sciences. And just through our alert, we've seen nearly 300 messages sent so far. And groups across the NDD spectrum are doing the same thing. So we're just sort of one piece of a very broad effort. However, even before we get a budget deal in place, we're looking ahead to see what the final numbers of the agencies we care about could be. And As we do every year, COSSA is joining with a lot of different coalitions that coalesce around individual agencies to make sure Congress knows that we care about robust funding. There's just a few on your screen. I know that there's more who we've joined with this year to advocate for agencies like NSF, NIH, the CDC, IES, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. There's an agriculture one. It sort of goes across the sort of spectrum of agencies we've already discussed today. And we also, in addition to signing letters, we have meetings with congressional staff and appropriations staff to talk more in depth about the funding situation for the different agencies and to demonstrate the breadth of the constituency that cares about each agency. And you can see on this screen, these are the funding levels that COSSA has endorsed for fiscal year 2020. All of these numbers represent a consensus among many organizations to advocate for a particular funding levels that we feel is appropriate for the agency and also reasonable given concerns about fiscal responsibility. The reason that we do this is it helps us present a united front to Congress when they consider what different stakeholders feel is the right amount of money for a given agency. It's much easier for them to look at one number rather than the number that COSSA cares about, which might be different from the number that AAAS cares about, which is different from another organization. So this way we can all be on the same page and while still advocating for the needs of a lot of different agencies. And as you've seen, in some of those Dear Colleague letters that Camille talked about, some of those numbers even match, I believe the NIH one does, to what the community is requesting.
Okay, great. So this is Wendy again, and I am going to finish us up here and finally turn to what you can do. We say that it's time to act, and so here is what we are looking for the community to do. Very quickly, where are we in the process? We threw a lot of information at you, talking about the president's request, what Congress cares about, what the community cares about, and what COSSA cares about. And so I think it's important to know where we fit in the broad sort of puzzle of the federal budget making process. So what's shown on the screen here is a typical regular order, the sort of hidden regular order. No one has really seen it in 20, 30 years. But this is how the budget is supposed to work. So we've talked about the president's budget request. And right now we're in the period where Congress is trying to adopt a budget resolution, which is tied to the caps discussion we were talking about. They're trying to work out the nuts and bolts of the budget at the highest level. How much does Congress have in its piggy bank to appropriate across the 12 appropriations bills? And then from there, the appropriators are really going to get to work. So this is the ideal time for our community to engage on these issues. Of course, there's a lot standing in the way of regular order. So there's 12 appropriations bills, which means that this process has to happen 12 times over an 8-month period, one for each bill. Which has proven to be almost impossible, at least for the last couple of decades. In addition, some bills are just more controversial than others. The Labor HHS bill, which funds the NIH and the Department of Education, also funds the Affordable Care Act in many regards. And so that bill is usually, with the rare exception of last year, one of the last bills to be considered and often doesn't receive its own appropriation. In addition, it's just really complicated right now. On any given day, the Congress and the executive branch can be working on 4 different budgets at any one time. They're auditing right now the 2018 budget. They're implementing 2019 right now, giving out the grants, spending money, spending dollars in states through block grants and other things. Congress is working to appropriate 2020. And in a couple of weeks, federal agencies in the White House, they're going to turn to 2021, even without having 2020 appropriations done. So there are a lot of moving parts. But most importantly, I think the end of earmarks has really made it hard for Congress to return to regular order. There were sticks and carrots involved by way of earmarks that really incentivize compromise among the parties. and forced everyone to sort of come to some sort of agreement on funding for different agencies, because it meant they were bringing home the bacon to some constituency back home. That's not the case anymore. So what is in it for the appropriators? What's in it for members of Congress to pass these bills and to really compromise with the other side? So I think that's really what's been holding up these negotiations for the last several years while earmarks have been gone. So in reality, the budget process rarely works as it should. We see continuing resolutions year after year, which is essentially a lifeboat. It's a way for the government to stay open, or not, if they don't pass a CR, which we saw over the last year. But it means no new starts, no increased funding. It means a lot of uncertainty, both for grantees, but also for the federal workforce. And unfortunately, it's become all too common of an occurrence here in Washington. But, you know, the positive side of this is, you know, not working in regular order typically means that we, stakeholders and constituents, have more time and more opportunities to engage in the process. So while many think you have to come to Washington in February and March, and then you're sort of, the horse has left the barn and there's no way to impact the budget, that's actually not true in practice. We are at the perfect point right now for all of us to get engaged. So what do we mean by that? Well, many of you, thanks again, are coming to Washington in just a couple of weeks for Advocacy Day. In fact, there's about 70 of you who are coming to Washington to speak with one voice and to advocate for all social behavioral science. And of course, there's still time to register, so if you're not currently registered, please do so. But there are also really important things that you can do from home. I'll get more into that in a second. First, let me say just one word about why it's so important that you engage and that you enact at this point in the process. So most Americans believe that their individual engagement won't make a difference. So there was a survey done in 2016 of registered voters that found that 11% of registered voters thought that members of Congress listen to their constituents. Only 11%. But as the table on the screen here shows, 94% of congressional staff said that in-person visits from constituents would have some or a lot of influence on an undecided lawmaker, and 92% said the same thing about individualized email messages, begging the case for your engagement either in person or from home. So contrary to what most think, members of Congress value constituents' input, and they rely on constituents' views to shape their opinions. I mean, they are there to represent you. They genuinely do wish to understand the impacts of a decision on citizens in the state or in the district. And constituents, i.e. voters, get priority treatment in the eyes of policymakers. Hence why we think it's so important to have folks in person putting sort of a human face on the issues that the COSSA team lobbies for every day of the year. But for you to come as someone who's a voter and someone who feels the impact is all that more powerful. But of course, it's not just for those coming to Washington. There is so much that you can do from home to have a big impact. So over the last 30 years, there's really been an explosion of grassroots advocacy. We've seen advances in technology. You may have seen through COSSA action alerts that there are easy ways now and cheaper ways to communicate with Congress. You fill out this web form, you put in your zip code, and off goes a letter to your policymaker. You don't have to do much about it. And as we said earlier, the end of earmarks has really changed lobbying forever. But the quality of those interactions has not improved. So we've seen an explosion of grassroots advocacy, more people going to the Hill in person and more people sending form letters, but it's not moving the dial in terms of sort of effective advocacy and lobbying. So the challenge here for everyone, whether you're coming in person or you're engaging from home, is being heard among all of the different voices and interests that a lawmaker's office may hear on any given day. So This is why it's really important that we give lawmakers a reason to care about our issues. Science can sometimes be in conflict with ideology or personal beliefs. And those of you coming to our seminar as part of Advocacy Day to prepare for your Hill meetings will have more to say about how ideology and religion and personal belief really are the, excuse me, really are of more importance to a lawmaker than science or any other sort of case that you can make to them. So there are a couple of strategies that we can employ in order to help bring them along on our issues. One being making it local. Again, this is why having constituents engaged is so important. I or Camille or Julia can go into a congressional office every day, and we do, and we advocate on your behalf. But it means so much more to the policymaker and to the process, frankly, to have those who come from the state and take the effort to make the case. And so we can transform a discussion about budget into a conversation about real people and their lives. And that is really the role that you all can play. So thankfully, COSSA has developed lots of materials. Many of these will be used, and you'll see them and receive hard copies of them if you're coming to Washington in a couple of weeks. And for those of you who are engaging from home, use these tools. The fact sheets on the left are brand new and in fact aren't even posted on our website yet, so you're getting a sneak peek here. But we've made sort of topical one-pagers on the value of social science to national security, to national welfare, to industry and business, and we're producing other ones as well on other topics, so that you can appeal. Again, we're trying to make policymakers care. We're trying to appeal to their interests. Maybe they're a former business person, maybe they served in the military. In addition, we help you try to make economic arguments. So you see our state fact sheet on the right that talks about how much social science funding comes from the federal government to the state every year. So do check out our resources and watch your inboxes if you're not coming to Washington, because we will be issuing an action alert on Social Science Advocacy Day on May 1st, where we hope that you will employ some of these devices to help you make a case remotely from home to policymakers. So again, this is the perfect time to act for all of the reasons that we've talked about. In terms of what you can do today, you can respond to our Raise the Caps action alert that was mentioned earlier. That's been live for a couple of weeks now, and we have almost 300 letters that have gone to the Hill just from COSSA, not from all of the other groups that we're working with. The number is in the thousands easily of letters, and we want more. Again, watch for our newest action alert on May 1st. But don't just send in those letters and stop there. Respond to them, share them with others in your circle, and follow your colleagues who are coming to Washington. We'll be tweeting about it. COSSA 2019 will be the Twitter handle or the hashtag for Advocacy Day, as will be Why Social Science. And with all of our partners throughout the community, we're using the hashtag Raise the Caps to really shine a light on how important it is to increase funding for all of the things that we care about. So we do have a few minutes, and the staff is happy to go over time if folks want to stick around and have a deeper discussion. You can either pose a question in the chat box, or you can raise your hand or try to unmute your line and ask questions to the team. So I will pause for just a second and allow those to come in.
Hey, Wendy, I have a question. This is Camille.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether it's effective to call congressional offices. Do they respond well to phone calls from constituents?
That's a very good question. You know, the short answer is any communication is important. And in fact, a lot of times a phone call can be more influential than, say, a form letter that looks very much like dozens of other form letters that are coming in. The challenge there, though, is, you know, there are phone calls coming in constantly to congressional offices, but it is the person's job who answers the phone to log all of those calls and to make sure that whatever you're asking for is routed to the appropriate person. So I would say yes, certainly if that's what you're most comfortable with, make a phone call. But I say the best thing you can do, aside from coming to Washington, would be to take an action alert sent by COSSA and tailor it. So we provide all the information you need if you had no time to do anything else but open up our alert and hit send. A letter will go out that has all the information that we want you to relay. But there is also an ability to tailor that message, to talk about your work, talk about the potential impacts of your work, or to talk about the value of social behavioral science more generally. Those messages stand out if they have something different than just sort of a copy and pasted form letter that comes in from hundreds of organizations but say the exact same thing. So the more you can do to put a personal spin on your communication, I think will have a lot more impact. Okay, we do have a couple of questions coming through the chat. Yes, a recording of this slideshow will be available who couldn't join. In fact, we send out the very next day, so tomorrow, you'll all receive a recording of this, as will others on our sort of members only list. But of course, you're in control of the emails that you receive, and so feel free to share how you see appropriate. They'll also be posted on our website, just so you know, if you've missed past headlines. We wait a couple of weeks because this is a members resource, but then we do post them publicly after about a month or so. So you can find some of our earlier discussion pieces on our website. And let's see, for those of us attending the Advocacy Day, is there anything that we need to do in advance? That's a great question. And we will be in touch over the next couple of weeks and provide you more guidance, both sort of logistically and in terms of ideas and ways that you can start preparing yourself. So watch for that in your email. This is not the only opportunity, certainly, to prepare to ask questions. But one thing you can start doing now, you know, when we're going to have a couple hours of a seminar on April 30th to go through everything. You'll meet your groups, you'll go through your schedule, we'll talk about how to have a meeting, but we'll also talk about what we're asking for and why we're asking for the things that we're asking for, which is essentially everything we just discussed. I wouldn't get bogged down now in trying to remember any of the numbers that we put in front of you, because the asks are going to be very simple for your Advocacy Day. It's going to be raise the caps, and then you can leave it there. You don't have to go into the details. It's going to be support funding for social and behavioral science research across the federal agencies. You don't have to know the individual numbers for all of those agencies. And the third ask, which I think is probably the most important, is to use you as a resource going forward. COSSA and our team has been most successful when we have nurtured an ongoing relationship with congressional staff who now turn to us for expertise. And then we turn to you, the community, when we need to find someone who knows something about artificial intelligence or another topic. We want you to become those direct contacts for congressional offices. So what you can do now is just start thinking about, what do I have to offer to a congressional office? What is my expertise in? And think about how you would talk about what it is you do or what it is you care about in terms that anybody could understand. I like to think of it as you're going home for Thanksgiving and you're going to meet with your grandma who has no idea what you do, but you have about 10 seconds before she gets preoccupied with somebody else to explain to her what it is you do and why it's important. That's hard to do, to come up with that sort of short way of describing the value of your work. So take a little bit of time and think about, if you had a couple of minutes with a policymaker, what would you like them to know about what you do and why it's important? Okay, while I wait to see if any other questions come in, here's your homework assignment. Every headlines, we like to give you all something to do should you wish to stay engaged in our activities. This month, our deep dive happens to be all about homework type assignments. But to reiterate, our active Raise the Caps alert is out now. and the link is on the page. Share it with everybody, and please respond. Advocacy Day, I'm not going to say it again, it's coming up. And if you're not receiving our members only messages directly from us, say someone in your institution forwards them to you, make sure you sign up directly. Go to our Take Action page on our website. The link is there, and sign up to receive our alerts. So if you're not coming to Washington on May 1st, you will receive an email directly from us and won't have to wait for someone to forward it that will let you participate in Social Science Advocacy Day from home. So that is something that you can also do now. You can also save the date for next month. We haven't decided on our deep dive topic yet, but next month we will certainly be back to talk about May's headlines and all of the news that is important for you to know. And as well, there is the website for headlines in case you missed, as I said earlier, previous webinars. We have recordings of them and you can see the slides as well. And finally, we like to end with this, which is if you found this useful, please do come back every month, the second Thursday of every month, so we can give you the latest on what we know. But I think even more importantly, tell your colleagues. As I said earlier, the best way for us to increase engagement is for you to just share our materials. So I hope you'll do that. I hope you'll sign up for our alerts, our members only activities. I hope you'll encourage others in your organization to do the same. And if you know, if you have colleagues at institutions that were not listed on our membership list, let us know or let them know that you value this and that they should engage in COSSA activities. And finally, we really want this to be a two-way conversation with our constituency, with you, our members. So if there's a topic that you're really interested in that you'd like the staff to do a deep dive on or have a guest speaker, please do send those our way and we will see what we can do to schedule those throughout the year. Seeing no other questions through the chat box or any hands raised, I will wish you a happy April, and we will see many of you in a couple of weeks, and the rest of you will talk to you next month when we go over our May headlines. Have a great day.